Welcome to Teso Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Lee.
We're back.
We are back, everybody.
Thank you for joining us again. We love the fact that you tune in to our podcast. We're very grateful for you, and we hope that you're learning things each time you join us, or if this is your first time, welcome.
Welcome.
I'm Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Lee, and this is our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. Mm-hmm. And in this podcast, we really take a look at those things that prevent us from being socially just and free, from having the society that we want. And so in this podcast, we really just sort of challenge each other and you to be the change you want to see.
So thank you for joining us. Today, our topic is racial stress and trauma.
Yeah.
So we're smiling now, but quite honestly, this is not a topic to smile about.
It's a pretty heavy topic.
It's a heavy topic. It's not one that we take lightly. And there's a lot to talk about that we will not be able to cover in 30 minutes. It's just not possible. And when we think about racial stress, we can talk about it from just our own experiences and the experiences of our families, and, what it has been like, just kind of living in our skin. Mm-hmm. And that's not always easy. I mean, we've had some great experiences, but we've had some really challenging ones too.
Absolutely. And not only, of course, us, but others who share our racial and our cultural background. Yeah. A lot of times you just carry things around with you, because if you address everything, it's just not possible.
And it's exhausting.
It is exhausting. But we want to talk about that, because I think sometimes in spaces where, there are African American people and we talk race, we do talk about the exhaustion, but very often we don't really zero in on the stress and the trauma of just sort of some of the context around race, some of the comments, and some of the situations that we find or that others kind of create. And we have to endure, quite frankly.
I want to share a story about my own grandfather. So my grandfather, who passed away in 1995, was the son of an enslaved man. And he was born in Mississippi. That's where his father was enslaved. And they moved to Chicago when he was a little boy. Whenever we, as young children, would ask my grandfather about his childhood, he would shut down. He would not talk about it. And he refused to ever step foot in Mississippi ever in his lifetime.
That's trauma.
That's trauma.
That's trauma.
And I remember in high school when one of my classmates, who happened to be white, liked me and gave me flowers for Valentine's Day. My grandfather was triggered by that. And I remember him saying, that there's only one thing that boy wants from you. And I was like, Grandpa, you know what you're talking about. He doesn't care about me like that, And as a kid, I didn't understand what my grandfather was talking about was his trauma as a Black man, and the experiences that he had as a Black boy, and the experiences that his siblings may have had. And to add to that story, I recently learned from my own father about my grandfather's oldest brother. So when his father passed away, the oldest brother kind of took on the role of patriarch in the family and helped raise him. And that older brother was actually sent to Chicago before the family joined him in Chicago because of something that occurred. I don't know what that something was in Mississippi, that he was going to lose his life if he didn't leave.
Yeah.
And then my grandfather's younger sister, who lived above him, my grandparents owned a 3-family home, and we would, go and see her, and we called her Aunt Sis. And Aunt Sis would tell us these stories. They were not developmentally appropriate, just to be honest, sadly, but Aunt Sis didn't have children and would not necessarily know that, you don't tell little kids this story, but she talked about having been raped by white men as a young woman. And as a little girl, I didn't really know what rape was, but I knew it was bad.
Yeah.
So whatever it was really, really bad. But I didn't really know exactly what that meant until I was old enough to really know what it meant. And that's trauma.
That's trauma. That's trauma. And I think many African American families have those kinds of stories for particularly the older, generation, those who, my family too came up. They were part of the Great Migration, and they came up because of the trauma that they experienced in the South. And so a lot of us have those kinds of really harrowing, triggering stories around racial trauma. And we just want to talk about that today because, first of all, those stories did not stop with the Great Migration. Right. So just because, a group, the group of African Americans that did come to the North en masse during the period of the Great Migration, it didn't stop. The racial trauma didn't stop just because they were in the North. And in fact, it carried on to the next generation and the next generation, and even into ours. And our kids experience racial trauma. So not overtly in the way that their ancestors did, but they still experience it, and so do we. And so when we're talking about racial stress and trauma, another term that we see used is racial battle fatigue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the term. All of it really speaks to the psychological and the emotional stress. And I almost feel like stress is almost an understatement.
Yeah, it's not a strong enough word.
It's not. Yeah. But it's the psychological and it's the emotional stress experienced.
Trauma.
It's trauma. It's trauma experienced by individuals in a marginalized racial or ethnic group. So though African Americans are not the only group that have experienced discrimination, ongoing discrimination, certainly in this country, ours is a group that has, I think, endured it severely through policy and laws, right, that actually justified and allowed a lot of this trauma and this stress. We were targeted in a lot of respects. We've talked about redlining previously, and we all know, at least I think we do, about, Jim Crow and those kinds of things. But outside of the South and Jim Crow, there are still these ongoing kinds of strategies that would marginalize people and kind of keep them in these spaces where they continue to experience racial stress and trauma.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this history is being banned in some states, in some schools. So students aren't even, allowed to learn about this. That may help develop, empathy and understanding about why there's so much inequity in our society.
Yeah. Right.
And sadly, there are people currently, who are lobbying against any kind of instruction in schools related to race or any, racial experiences. And what that does is it further traumatizes, the next generation because there seems to be an erasure of sorts.
Yes, that's right.
And it's what happened to, enslaved people when they were brought here. There was an erasure of their culture, an erasure of their identity. They were given new names and, told that they were not allowed to, live in ways that they may have known, and their culture was very much, minimized and diminished and devalued and erased from many of them, and that they were told that they need to now act like, they're enslavers. And so, this history is steep and very traumatic. And now there's a generation of legislators who are saying, we can't have this conversation about this in school, thereby saying any kind of conversation around race, thereby saying that the students who are students, who racialized students, are not valued.
Yeah, and so everything that, the way that you characterize it so wonderfully, really is really about the erasure, right? So I'm a student, I'm an African American student, and I live in a community, or I'm living in an environment, or I'm going to school in an environment where, I still am subject to, microaggressions and insults or slurs. And because if I'm not taught the history, if I don't know that this is sort of the latest iteration of a long line of injustices and unfair treatment, then how do I consider that? And so we add more stress and more trauma by not giving kids the information and the language to understand like what's happening here. Right. So when I, in my high school, we actually had a Black History program, but I had been taught a lot of that through like church and my parents, and in my community, there was a lot of conversation around Black history. And I even remember, do you remember the McDonald's? McDonald's had like a Black History series or something.
I don't remember
they had
that.
Books I remember that. Like,
wow.
I remember kind of growing up in that time where the information was readily available. And because of that, when there were injustices that happened to me or around me, I understood how to consider it. It didn't make me super revolutionary, but it did make me kind of savvy when it came to understanding discrimination, understanding slights, and understanding how my racial, background is considered or not considered, and why. And so I think that, we actually provide, some, we just do a disservice to our kids when they are not allowed to learn their history, and the history of other groups that are marginalized, right? But when they're not allowed to learn their history, so that when something comes, because you know the phrase, if you don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So if I don't learn my history, this is going to come around again, and I'm not going to know what to do with it, or how to consider it, or even how to take action. But I want to go back to this idea of the psychological and the emotional stress. Because I think the other piece of that is, this happens frequently. Like, we are still in spaces where we understand that a lot of what we say and the information that we provide, which is not sort of coming out of our heads, right? This is well researched, evidence-based information that we provide to groups around racial stress and trauma and cultural equity and cultural responsiveness and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of those we understand very often that it is not received very well because of the package that, you know, in which it comes. So 2 African American women talking to, you know, large groups of people who are not African American and maybe not even women, but, you know, we know that maybe they are women, but we know that it's not received well because in this country, there's still something about, you know, African Americans, you know, not being in positions of authority to tell anybody, right, how they should think, or and we carry that. We talk a lot of it. One of the strategies we have is we're able to identify it and we're able to discuss it until we feel better, right?
Yeah.
But imagine kids that, you know, endure these racial, you know, these microaggressions or the macroaggressions, and they don't have the language, and they may not have anybody to talk to about how they're feeling, because you feel it physically. I'll speak for myself. I feel it physically.
Yes, yes. There's a stress that happens, so it's not just emotional.
Yeah.
So it creates stress.
Yeah.
So, you know, you and I are, you know, we're trainers.
Yeah.
You know, and we do this training around racial equity often. But there are times that we're in spaces where the resistance is so strong, you know, where we are being challenged, even about what the research says. And, you know, it's clear that we're not being received. And what happens physically in my body is I'll feel a tension in my shoulders and neck first, which may then, you know, trickle down to the back. There may be a clenching that I, you know, like with my in parts of my body, a tenseness that I feel in my body. That stress is not healthy. And what it does, it actually does something to our brains. So what we don't, not just our brains, other parts of our body. So stress can produce more cortisol in our body. And that cortisol could increase things like, you know, our blood pressure, it could increase our weight, it could increase heart disease, diabetes. You know, it can have a physical manifestation and create disease in our bodies. In our brains, it enlarges the amygdala. And so that's the part of the brain that responds, you know, to danger, fight, flight, or freeze, or appease. And that part of the brain can be enlarged, which is not healthy because it puts you in this heightened state of like, you know, tension and anxiety. And where we need the frontal cortex of our brain to be much more relaxed and calm. And, you know, we can do things like meditation, you know, 20 minutes a day that can increase the frontal cortex and actually decrease the amygdala. That, by the way, is a strategy. If you haven't tried it, it really is really important and critical. You need to learn about how do you actually go through the process of meditating to relax yourself, and it can decrease the stress that you may feel in your body. But this is not good for you.
Right.
So now here we are, adults who are trained to have these conversations and are training others to be able to engage in this conversation, and we feel this stress. So now imagine what it's like to work in a place day after day, and we've been told in environments where we've gone, we've been told privately by people of color that, well, I'm not going to be able to speak up, you know, in this setting because I have to work with these people.
I have to work with these people. That's right.
And I'm dealing with stress on a daily basis around my race and or culture or even religion. You know, and sometimes their LGBTQ status, all of those things. We've had people privately tell us we can't talk about this with our colleagues because we will be ostracized in some way.
And that's in a professional setting where we're supposed to be talking about race, culture, gender, identity. Like, you have the permission here to do that
as adults.
And they still don't feel safe to do that.
So now let's talk about the kids in classrooms. You know, classrooms where they may be one of a few. You know, or the only one in that classroom. What that stress looks like for that kid.
As early as kindergarten and pre-K. right? As
Yeah.
early, kids know when they're not being treated fairly. Kids know when somebody doesn't like them.
Yes.
Kids know when something isn't right.
They're intuitive.
They know, they're intuitive.
Yep.
And
Very
so
innate.
all of that, that reaction that you just talked about, the reaction to stress. Imagine it happening over your entire lifetime around, racial stressors.
Right. Right.
Your entire lifetime. So
Right.
from pre-K, you're in situations where, there are, these triggers or these events that are happening, and the unfairness of it. You know that. And so, or you sense it.
Right.
Or maybe you don't have
You
the
may
language.
not have the language.
You may not
Right.
have the language, but you still have those physical reactions
Yeah.
to trauma.
I mean, I've told the story before, and I think this is appropriate to mention it again. When I was a second grader, initially there were 2 black students in the classroom. There was a boy, and he left, at some point early in the school year, and I was the only black child in that classroom, and my teacher was a white woman. Now, I've shared in previous podcasts that I had a kindergarten and first grade teacher who were both black women, and so they were very affirming, which they created this love of learning and love of school in me. I go to second grade, I expect the same kind of experience. Instead, I met with a teacher who is nasty towards me, who treats me differently and is mean to me, won't call on me when I raise my hand, or may say things to me that she doesn't say to my peers. And as a 7-year-old, I didn't have the language. I didn't know what was going on. I just kept feeling like she's treating me differently. And the only thing different about me is the fact that I'm black and my classmates are not. That was the only thing that I noticed as a kid.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't just my imagination, because when I was an adult, my parents handed me my, childhood mementos with the box with the, second grade report card. And there was nothing positive that teacher had to say about me.
In second grade.
I was 7 years
How did
old.
you not have something positive
Right.
to say,
So here I'm feeling like, okay, now I understood why my parents spent so much time trying to help me feel good about my identity as a black girl, saying things like black is beautiful. Like I heard that as young as 4, 5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
I heard that over and over again, and I was affirmed in that way as a little girl. And so when this teacher is now treating me differently, as a kid, I'm like, this teacher is a problem. I was fortunate to have, the kind of support at home that made me realize it's not my issue. This is her issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have that language back
Sure.
then, but I did not take on what she was giving.
That's great.
However, I never forgot it. So that's trauma right there.
Trauma.
The
Yes,
fact
it
that
is.
here I am 50 something years old, and I can recall, very, very like
Amazing
explicitly,
clarity. Yeah.
right, what happened to me as a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Like that is just like ridiculous, because what we're talking about is a child's identity.
Yeah.
So their racial identity is very much a part of who they are
Yes.
as individuals. And if it's not affirmed and if it's not supported, what happens to that kid?
Well, there are a lot of signs, right? There are a lot of signs of, racial trauma and stress, and, sadness is one of them. If there is a student or a colleague that, it's really, sad or withdrawn or has, some anxiety in that learning or that working space, it could be a sign, particularly if they are members of a marginalized community in some way. I think also irritability. Sometimes we sort of write off our irritable coworkers. We write off those who are withdrawn or isolated, but a lot of times there is a reason why they experience, especially if you know that they are not that way in other contexts,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Or even, like avoidance behavior. So they don't want to participate, or they'd rather not be a part of the group. We talked about belonging in an earlier episode. If you realize that they generally feel like they do not belong to this group, that is one of those, signs that could indicate that, this individual has undergone some racial stress or trauma. We were reading an article from Ed Week, and there's a professor out of Stanford University, Farzana Salim. And one of the things she says is that it's important to teach kids and individuals in general about, like, she called it psychoeducation. So teach them about racial trauma, like teach them about it so that they know what those signs are, so that, you were talking about the physical manifestations, or the way that you feel physically. And, the deep breathing helps, and the talking helps. But, like you said, we work in this field. And so we recognize, when we're starting to feel stress, that, racial stress, we recognize that. But we know that, we need to provide kids with those same strategies. We need to provide individuals in marginalized communities. We need to provide them with those same strategies and that same awareness, so that when they start to feel it, they know what it is and they can start combating it, right?
But that's only a piece of the puzzle.
That's only a piece of the puzzle.
Right. The other piece is, now let's look at the systemic issue going on here.
That's right.
What are we going to do about that issue?
Yeah.
So that's where we need, voices, from adults who are going to stand up and push back against a system that is looking to minimize groups of people and, diminish them or erase them.
Right.
Erase them from the history books, erase their stories from the history books, erase their stories from being told at all, and from it being a topic of conversation because, other kids might be uncomfortable. Well, imagine the discomfort that students of color have to endure day after day after day, month after month, year after year, so that they people talk about, like, the angry black woman or angry black man. What do you think precipitated that?
Yeah, that's right.
What's at the root of that anger? Some of it could be because of how society has marginalized them, has marginalized their families, and continue to do so in some spaces, not everywhere.
And even that sort of that character of that stereotype of the angry, even that has been sort of like marginalized and minimized.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not taken seriously. And you're right, that comes from somewhere, that anger, one of my brothers calls, he refers to it as rage. Like, you just get in this space where you're so angry. And a lot of times it's because you realize that this whole system has conspired to, marginalize or discriminate against, people who, you identify with, and, racially, or even, in terms of gender or socioeconomic status. So, we started off early saying that this was a pretty heavy conversation, and it is, but it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah.
And we invite you to join in on this conversation. We'd like to know, how have you experienced it, or how have you witnessed it, or how have you advocated for someone who, how have you served as an ally for someone or some group of people that you have recognized that have, experienced racial stress or trauma.
Yeah. I think that's really important. And it's not to say every space is like that. It's not. Right. But the truth is, if we're experiencing it anywhere, then it's going to impact us.
Yeah.
And, how can we create a society where this is no longer an issue, where people don't feel like they have to be marginalized, where they have a voice, where they are valued, where they don't have to be erased in some way, or don't feel they want to erase themselves to assimilate into society, to be accepted.
Right.
That's not the kind of life that is, the most fulfilling life to have, where you are, aspiring to be something that you're not, and your identity is not valued.
That's right.
And so, we invite you, as Erika was saying, we invite you to just kind of give us some feedback on this topic. Where do you see this happening in either your life or the lives of others? And what are you going to do about it? That's a really challenging question. What are you going to do about it? So thank you for joining us today. We do hope that this was a topic that at least caused you to have to think, if not act. Because that, I think, is where we get change, when actions happen.
Absolutely.
And so we want to encourage you to continue to stay with us and to give us your feedback. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika, and thank you for joining us today.